The Grand Crest Hotel, an aging structure tucked to the outskirts of a small mountain town, had once been a beacon of luxury. Now it was a relic of its former self. Its grand ballroom filled with shadows, its chandeliers dulled by dust. Travelers still stayed, drawn by cheap rates and morbid curiosity. But locals never lingered after sunset, and they always avoided room 616. Kara didn't believe in ghosts. A freelance journalist, she prided herself on debunking urban legends. She had heard the stories about room 616, the whispering walls, the sudden chill, and the guests who checked in but never checked out. It was all nonsense to her, perfect fodder for her next article. Armed with her laptop, recorder, and an overnight bag, Kara booked a one-night stay in the infamous room. When she arrived, the concierge, an older man with weary eyes, hesitated before handing over the key. "If you hear anything odd, just call the front desk," he said, his voice low. Kara smirked and took the key without a second thought. The hallway leading to room 6116 was eerily quiet, the plush carpet muffling her steps. She paused outside the door, noting the faint scratches around the keyhole, as if someone or something had tried desperately to get in. Shaking off the unease, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was ordinary. A queen bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking the parking lot. Yet there was something oppressive about the air, as if the room was holding its breath. Kara set up her equipment, determined to stay objective. She began recording, narrating her impressions and mocking the ghost stories. As the hours ticked by, the room seemed to grow colder. At first, it was subtle, a chill on the back of her neck. Then the temperature plummeted, and her breath misted in the air. Kara grabbed her phone to check the thermostat, but her screen was blank, refusing to turn on. The room clock, too, had stopped at 3:16 a.m. A soft, scratching sound came from the walls. Kara froze, her heart hammering. It could be mice, she reasoned. The scratching grew louder, closer, until it seemed to surround her. Then came the whispering, a low, indistinct murmur that ebbed and flowed like a tide. Kara strained to make out the words, but they were in a language she didn't recognize. Determined not to panic, she grabbed her recorder and turned it on, hoping to capture the sound. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped. For a moment there was silence, and Kara almost laughed at her own fear. Then the closet door creaked open. Kara whipped around, clutching the recorder like a weapon. The closet was empty, but the air inside seemed darker, as if the shadows were denser there. Her recorder crackled, and a voice, distorted and malevolent, hissed, "Get out!" Kara stumbled back, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. She had to leave, had to get out of this cursed room. But when she grabbed the doorknob, it wouldn't turn. She pulled and yanked, but the door refused to budge. The whispering resumed, louder now, overlapping voices filling the room with an unbearable cacophony. Suddenly, the mirror above the dresser shattered, shards spraying across the floor. In the fractured glass, Kara saw her reflection, but it wasn't hers. The figure staring back had hollow eyes, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It raised a hand and pointed behind her. Kara spun around and the room was empty, but the whispers had converged into one chilling word: run. The door flew open on its own, and Kara didn't hesitate. She sprinted down the hallways, not stopping until she was outside, gasping for air under the cold night sky. She glanced back at the hotel, half expecting to see something watching her from the window of room 16, but it was dark. The next morning, Kara returned to retrieve her belongings. The concierge handed her the bag, his face grim. "I told you to call if something happened," he said. Kara didn't reply. She didn't tell him that her recorder was empty, every file erased. She didn't mention the scratches on her arms she couldn't explain, or the faint whispers that still echoed in her ears. She only knew one thing: she would never write about room 616. Some stories were meant to stay untold. The Ravenwood Inn was known for its vintage charm, its antique furnishings, and its unsettling history. Built in the late 1800s, the hotel had been the site of a notorious murder-suicide. A man named Victor Reed had slaughtered his fiancée, Annabelle, and then himself in room 303. Since then, guests often reported strange occurrences: phantom footsteps, cries in the night, and a lingering scent of roses, Annabelle's favorite flower. Skeptics dismissed the stories as overactive imaginations, but when Sophie and her friends arrived for a weekend getaway, they were eager to test the legends for themselves. A group of 4-4 thrill-seekers, they insisted on booking room 303 despite the receptionist's visible discomfort. You should pick another room, the young clerk said, her voice faltering. That room, it's not like the others. That's why we want it, Sophie replied with a grin, her friends nodding behind her. The room was everything they had hoped for. A beautiful, old-fashioned suite with a grand four-poster bed, heavy curtains, and a gilded mirror that reflected the faint light from a flickering chandelier. The faint scent of roses hung in the air. They joked about the smell as they unpacked and set up their cameras, determined to capture evidence of the supernatural. The first few hours were uneventful. They played card games, laughed, and took turns telling ghost stories. Sophie occasionally glanced at the mirror, unnerved by the way it seemed to distort their reflections in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. She blamed it on the warped glass, but a feeling of unease lingered. At midnight, the atmosphere changed. The laughter died away, replaced by an oppressive silence. The temperature dropped sharply, and the rose scent grew stronger, almost suffocating. Sophie noticed the chandelier swaying slightly, though the windows were closed. "Did anyone else feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, a loud thud came from the adjoining bathroom. They all froze, staring at the closed door. "It's probably just the pipes," Greg, the bravest of the group, said. He grabbed his flashlight and approached the door. "Be careful," Sophie warned, but he waved her off. Greg pushed the door open, and the flashlight beam swept across the empty bathroom. The clawfoot tub gleamed in the dim light, its porcelain surface pristine, except for the word "leave" scrawled in dripping red letters on the tiled wall. "What the hell?" Greg muttered, backing away. "That's not funny," Sophie snapped, glaring at her friends. "We didn't do that," Emma insisted, her face pale. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, nearly trapping Greg inside. He yanked it open and stumbled back into the room, his expression panicked. "This isn't funny anymore," he said. "We need to go." Before they could agree, the mirror shattered with a deafening crash, shards raining down onto the floor. In the fractured surface, they saw a fleeting image of a man in a dark suit, his eyes hollow and his mouth twisted in a snarl. He raised a hand, and the lights in the room flickered violently. The door to the hallway creaked open on its own, and the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed in the corridor. They grabbed their things and bolted, but as they reached the lobby, Sophie realized her phone was still in the room. "I'll get it," she said, ignoring their protests. "I'll be quick." Sophie raced back to room 303, her heart pounding. The door was ajar, and the room was eerily still. The scent of roses was overpowering now, making her gag. She spotted her phone on the nightstand and snatched it, but as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut. The lights went out, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her phone flashlight, but before she could turn it on, a cold hand brushed her shoulder. She screamed and spun around, but no one was there. The scent of roses was replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of blood. Then she saw them. Two figures stood in the corner of the room, a woman in a blood-stained gown and a man with a cruel grin and lifeless eyes. The woman's lips moved as if pleading, but no sound came out. The man stepped closer, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. Sophie backed away, her hands trembling. "Stay away!" she screamed. The man's grin widened as he raised a bloodied hand and pointed at her. "You're next," he growled, his voice a guttural rasp. The door flew open, and Sophie didn't think twice. She ran, nearly tripping over the broken glass, and didn't stop until she was outside. Her friends found her shaking and gasping for air. Sophie never spoke about what she saw that night, but when the hotel staff entered room 303 the next morning, they found her phone lying on the bed, its camera still recording. The final seconds of the video showed Sophie running, followed by the faint outline of a man's shadow stretching toward the lens. The recording ended with a whisper, "See you soon." The Blackstone Hotel stood as a towering relic in the heart of the city, its once elegant facade now weathered by time. Despite its decline, it remained a popular choice for budget travelers. Yet, locals often avoided it, muttering cryptic warnings about the forgotten guest who never left room 907. Olivia, a seasoned travel blogger, had heard the rumors but brushed them aside. She was on a mission to explore haunted hotels, and the Blackstone was next on her list. When she requested room 907 at check-in, the clerk's expression darkened. "Ma'am, I really can't recommend that room," he said. "Strange things happen up there." "That's why I want it," Olivia replied confidently. She had faced eerie tales before, and none had truly scared her. The elevator groaned as it ascended to the 9th floor, the air growing colder with each passing level. The doors creaked open to reveal a dimly lit hallway. Room 907 was at the far end, its number plaque slightly askew, as if hastily reattached. Inside, the room was ordinary. Drab beige walls, a faded floral bedspread, and a musty smell that seemed typical for an aging hotel. Olivia unpacked her equipment, setting up a small camera and voice recorder. She planned to document everything. By 10 p.m., the room had grown eerily quiet. Outside, the city buzzed with life, but no sound penetrated the room's thick walls. Olivia felt the stillness press down on her, but she dismissed it as nerves. Around midnight, things began to change. First came the knocking. It started faintly, a soft tap, tap, tap that seemed to come from the wall behind the bed. Olivia paused her typing and listened. The knocks grew louder, more insistent, until they became a frantic pounding. She got up and placed her ear against the wall. "Hello?" she called out. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural whisper that sent shivers down her spine. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably angry. Determined to remain rational, she grabbed her recorder and pressed play, hoping it had captured the sound. The playback began with her voice asking, "Hello?" followed by a chilling response in a voice not her own, "Get out." Olivia froze, her heart racing. This wasn't a prank. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath came out in frosty puffs. The scent of damp earth filled the air, and the edges of the room seemed to blur, as if the walls were closing in. The bathroom door creaked open slowly. Olivia turned, her stomach knotting. She had left the door closed. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. A faint figure emerged, barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, gaunt and dressed in tattered clothing that looked decades old. His eyes were hollow, his face pale and twisted in agony. "Leave," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. Olivia stumbled backward, tripping over her suitcase. She scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was closer now, its form flickering like a distorted projection. The walls around her began to bleed, crimson streaks dripping down and pooling on the carpet. A cacophony of voices erupted, screaming, crying, and whispering all at once. In the midst of the chaos, Olivia noticed something etched into the mirror above the dresser. "One of us." The figure reached out, its skeletal fingers brushing her shoulder. An overwhelming wave of cold washed over her, and she collapsed, her vision fading. When she awoke, the room was silent. Morning light streamed through the window, and everything appeared normal. But Olivia knew better. Her equipment was gone, her laptop wiped clean. On the nightstand lay a single piece of yellowed paper, the handwriting jagged and uneven. "Welcome to room 907. Stay forever." Olivia fled the Blackstone Hotel and never spoke of her experience. But she heard rumors later. Guests who stayed in room 907 often vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their belongings. And every so often, late at night, someone would report seeing a woman's pale face staring out from the window of room 907, her eyes wide with terror, forever trapped with the forgotten guest. The Crescent Vale Inn was known for its charm and history, but it also had a reputation for being deeply unsettling. Perched on a lonely hill surrounded by thick forest, it had been in operation for over a century. Travelers often spoke of its maze-like corridors and the eerie feeling of being watched. Tom, a traveling salesman, wasn't one for ghost stories. He had been on the road for hours and just needed a place to sleep. When he arrived at the inn late one stormy evening, the desk clerk, a frail woman with unnerving eyes, handed him a key to room 117. "There are no refunds," she said cryptically as he turned to leave. Tom shrugged it off, chalking it up to small-town oddity. The hallway to his room was long and dimly lit. The carpet faded and frayed at the edges. The storm outside rattled the windows, but the silence inside was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of a flickering light overhead. Room 117 was modest, queen bed, wooden desk, a single chair by the window. Tom tossed his bag on the bed and noticed the faint scent of mildew in the air. He pulled the curtains shut against the storm and settled in for the night. At 2:13 a.m., he woke abruptly. A loud thump echoed from somewhere above him, followed by a faint dragging sound. Tom listened, his pulse quickening. He figured it was just another guest, though he hadn't seen anyone else since he arrived. Unable to shake the unease, he decided to step into the hallway to clear his head. The corridor was darker now, the overhead lights dimmed to a feeble glow. Tom walked aimlessly, his bare feet muffled by the old carpet. As he turned a corner, something strange happened. The hallway stretched before him, longer than it should have been. He could see the faint outline of doors on either side, but no matter how far he walked, the end never came closer. He stopped and looked behind him. The corner he had just turned was gone, replaced by an identical stretch of hallway. A chill ran down his spine. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. The air grew heavier, the faint scent of mildew replaced by something sharp and metallic. He turned back and started walking faster, his breaths coming in short gasps. Then he saw it. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure. It was barely visible in the dim light, but it was there, tall, thin, and motionless. Its head tilted slightly, as if observing him. "Who's there?" Tom demanded, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Tom took a step back, then another, but the figure grew closer. It didn't walk or run. It just shortened the distance between them with every blink. Panicking, Tom turned and bolted in the opposite direction. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, the doors blurring together. He yanked at the handles as he passed, but each one was locked. Behind him, he heard a sound, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the walls. "Help! Somebody help me!" he screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the suffocating silence. The growl grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of heavy, wet footsteps. Tom risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the figure again, closer now. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. He ran faster, his legs burning, his lungs straining. Suddenly, he tripped, crashing to the ground. As he scrambled to his feet, he realized the carpet beneath him was soaked, the wetness seeping into his clothes. The metallic scent was overwhelming now, and when he looked down, he saw that the floor was stained red. A door creaked open ahead of him. Desperate, Tom lunged toward it and flung himself inside, slamming it shut behind him. The room was identical to the one he had left earlier. The same bed, the same desk, the same chair by the window. But when he turned toward the bed, his blood ran cold. A body lay sprawled across the mattress, its face twisted in terror. It was him. The door behind him creaked open, and the figure stepped inside. For the first time, Tom could see its face, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and grinning with jagged, blood-stained teeth. It reached out, and everything went black. The next morning, the inn's cleaning staff found room 117 empty. Tom's belongings were gone, and the bed was neatly made. But guests who stayed at the Crescent Vale Inn after that night reported strange noises in the hallway outside room 117, footsteps that never seemed to end, and a faint, desperate voice calling for help. Nestled on the edge of a bustling city, the Marlowe Tower Apartments was an old, towering building, with its faded bricks and rusted fire escapes giving off an air of quiet neglect. Its cheap rent drew a mix of young professionals and transients, but the 11th floor had a reputation that made many avoid it. Rumors swirled about strange occurrences, particularly in apartment 1102. Lila, a graduate student new to the city, ignored the warnings. She was broke and desperate for a place close to campus. The apartment was perfect, one bedroom, fully furnished, and ridiculously cheap. "It's just stories," she told herself as she signed the lease. Her first few nights were uneventful. The apartment was quiet, though there was a faint smell she couldn't quite place, damp with a hint of something metallic. She dismissed it as part of the building's age. On the fourth night, she heard it, a faint rustling sound, like paper being shuffled coming from the living room. Lila, half asleep, assumed it was the wind, but when she checked, the windows were shut tight. The next morning, she noticed small things out of place. A mug on the counter she didn't remember leaving there. Her keys moved from the entryway table to the floor. She chalked it up to exhaustion and stress, but the disturbances grew. One night, as she studied late into the evening, she felt a sharp chill, despite the heater humming. Then came the unmistakable sensation of someone watching her. She turned abruptly, but no one was there. When she went to bed, she heard the whispering for the first time. It was faint, almost inaudible, like someone murmuring just outside her door. Lila froze, clutching the blankets. She thought about calling the building manager, but convinced herself it was her neighbors. Still, she barely slept. Over the next few days, the whispers became louder, clearer. They seemed to move through the apartment, starting in the living room before sliding into the hallway. One night, she swore she heard her name. Lila. She searched the apartment from top to bottom, but found nothing. That was when she noticed the closet in the bedroom, a place she hadn't paid much attention to before. The door was slightly ajar, though she always kept it closed. Inside, the air was stifling, the smell of damp and metal stronger. Hanging clothes swayed gently, though there was no draft. She stared at the back wall, realizing it didn't look right. The plaster was cracked, the edges of a faint outline visible, almost like a hidden door. Her heart raced as she ran her fingers over it. The plaster crumbled easily, and behind it she found a narrow, pitch-black passage. Panicking, she called the building manager. He arrived within the hour, his face darkening when he saw the passage. "You shouldn't have opened that," he muttered. "What is this?" Lila demanded. It's nothing. We'll seal it back up. Don't worry about it." But Lila couldn't let it go. That night, she barricaded the closet with her dresser and sat awake with every light on. Around 3 a.m., she heard a loud thud, something heavy slamming against the closet door. The whispers came again, louder, almost frantic. "Lila, let us in." Terrified, she grabbed her phone to call the police. But the screen flickered and went dead. The lights in the apartment began to dim one by one until only the lamp beside her remained. The air grew colder and she heard scratching, long, deliberate strokes coming from inside the closet. Then came the voice, deep and guttural. "You can't keep us out forever." The dresser slid an inch, then another, as if pushed by an unseen force. Lila screamed and ran for the door, fumbling with the lock. Behind her, the dresser toppled with a deafening crash. She didn't look back as she fled the building, sprinting into the night. The next morning, she returned with the police. They found the apartment undisturbed. No toppled dresser, no sign of a hidden passage in the closet. It was as if nothing had happened. But Lila refused to stay another night. She moved out that same day, breaking her lease. Weeks later, she heard a news report about a new tenant in apartment 1102 who had vanished without a trace. The neighbors claimed they heard whispers the night he disappeared. Whispers calling out a name that wasn't his. Lila. In a forgotten corner of the countryside, there stood an old, crumbling inn called the Hollow Hearth. It was said to have been a thriving inn centuries ago, but now it catered mostly to lost travelers and the occasional thrill seeker looking for a brush with the supernatural. Among the many tales tied to the inn, one was whispered more than others: the legend of the room with no number. Alex, a seasoned urban explorer, had read about the inn online. Determined to document its secrets for his growing blog, he booked a stay despite the warnings. Upon his arrival, the innkeeper, a wiry man with tired eyes, greeted him with a grave expression. "Stay out of the far left wing," the innkeeper said, sliding over an old brass key. "It's sealed off for a reason." "Why?" "What's there?" Alex asked, his curiosity immediately piqued. "Just don't go," the innkeeper replied, refusing to elaborate. The inn itself was as eerie as its reputation. Faded wallpaper curled away from damp walls, and the creaking of the wooden floors seemed to echo louder than it should. Alex's room, though small and clean enough, had an uneasy air. It was just after midnight when Alex decided to explore. Equipped with a flashlight and his camera, he crept out of his room and made his way to the forbidden wing. The air grew colder as he neared the far left hallway, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist unnaturally. The corridor was completely dark, the old sconces lining the walls long extinguished. His flashlight revealed peeling paint and an unsettling stillness, as though the space hadn't been disturbed in decades. And then he saw it. A door at the end of the hall, its surface warped and cracked. Unlike the others, it bore no number. It didn't even seem to have a lock, just a rusted handle. Alex felt a pang of hesitation but forced it down. He had come here for an adventure, and this was too good to pass up. He reached for the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. His flashlight illuminated a barren space. No furniture, no windows, just a bare wooden floor covered in strange, dark stains. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood. As he stepped inside, his flashlight flickered. He cursed under his breath, tapping it until the light steadied. That's when he noticed the writing. Scrawled across the walls in jagged, haphazard letters were words that chilled him to his core. It watches. It waits. It never leaves. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Alex spun around, heart pounding, and tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. The room grew colder. his breath fogging in the frigid air, and then he heard it. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. The scratching grew louder, now joined by a low, guttural whisper. He shone his flashlight toward the far corner of the room, and his blood ran cold. A figure crouched there, its back turned to him. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin a sickly mottled gray. It rocked back and forth, muttering incoherently. Alex's instincts screamed at him to leave, but his feet were rooted in place. The figure stopped rocking. Slowly, it turned its head toward him, its neck cracking unnaturally with the motion. Its face was featureless, except for a wide, gaping mouth that stretched impossibly far, lined with jagged teeth. "Why did you come here?" It rasped, its voice echoing as if spoken from all directions. Alex bolted for the door, pounding and screaming for help. The room seemed to warp around him, the walls closing in and the whispers growing deafening. When he finally turned back toward the corner, the figure was gone. But then a hand gripped his shoulder. Alex woke up in the lobby of the inn, sprawled on the dusty carpet. The innkeeper stood over him, his expression grim. "You went to the wrong place," the innkeeper said, shaking his head. Alex tried to explain, but his words came out garbled. He glanced down at his hands and froze. His nails were torn and bloody, his palms covered in deep scratches, as if he'd clawed at the door for hours. When he checked his camera later, he found only one image, a blurred photo of the featureless figure, its mouth wide open in a silent scream. The hollow hearth was condemned a few months later, but locals swear they still see a faint light glowing from the far left wing, and the sound of scratching that never seems to stop. In the heart of the city, the Luxor Grand Hotel was renowned for its elegance and grandeur. It boasted 100 floors of luxury, catering to the rich and famous. Yet, hidden among its glitz was a legend whispered by staff and longtime guests alike: the vanishing floor. Elena, a journalist chasing urban myths, booked a weekend stay to investigate. The story went that somewhere between the 12th and 14th floors, an unmarked level would sometimes appear in the elevators late at night. Guests who stumbled upon it were said to vanish, leaving only cryptic traces behind. On her first night, Elena noticed nothing unusual. She dined at the rooftop restaurant, wandered the pristine lobby, and reviewed her notes in her lavish suite on the 15th floor. It was around 2:33 a.m. when her room phone rang. The voice on the other end was faint and distorted. "Come find me," it whispered. Before she could respond, the line went dead. Her heart raced, but she dismissed it as a prank. Curiosity tugged at her, though, and she decided to take a walk. The hallways were eerily quiet, and as she approached the elevator, she felt a chill that raised the hairs on her arms. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. But instead of descending, the elevator shuddered, the lights flickering, and then began to climb. The digital floor display flicked erratically. 13, 12, 14, 13 again, and then it stopped entirely. The elevator came to a jarring halt. The doors slid open to reveal a dimly lit hallway she didn't recognize. The air was stale, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, stained with dark, unidentifiable streaks. A brass plaque by the elevator door read, "Floor 13." Elena hesitated but stepped out, her journalistic instinct overriding her fear. The carpet beneath her feet squelched as though soaked, though there was no visible moisture. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors that seemed to lean at odd angles. One door at the far end was slightly ajar, and from within came a faint, irregular tapping sound. "Hello?" Elena called out, her voice trembling. The tapping stopped. Her heart pounded as she approached the door. Pushing it open revealed a small, dimly lit room. The furniture was overturned, and the walls were covered in more of the strange, dark stains. On the floor, written in what looked horrifyingly like blood, was her name. Elena, it spelled out in looping, jagged letters. Behind her, the door slammed shut. She whirled around, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was obscured by a veil of black hair, and its head tilted unnaturally as though studying her. "You came," it hissed in a voice that sounded like wind through broken glass. Elena stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. Her mind raced for a way out, but the figure was already moving toward her, its bony hands reaching out. "No," she screamed, throwing a lamp in its direction. The glass shattered, but the figure didn't flinch. Just as it reached her, the room plunged into complete darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the elevator. The floor display read "Lobby," and the doors slid open to reveal the familiar, bustling reception area. She stumbled out, her knees weak, and caught the concerned gaze of the night clerk. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked. "Floor 13, she managed to whisper. The clerk's face went pale. "There is no floor 13, he said. When Elena checked her phone, she found a single new photo in her gallery. It was of the room with her name written on the floor, and in the background, the shadowy figure staring straight at the camera. She never returned to the Luxor Grand, but in the weeks that followed, she began receiving emails from an untraceable address. Each one contained a single word: "Come back." And each time, attached to the email was the same photo, the figure in the background drawing closer with every message. The Whispering Pines Lodge was a charming retreat hidden deep in the mountains. Famous for its antique decor and panoramic views, it was also notorious for unsettling rumors about Room 42. Guests who stayed there spoke of strange occurrences, reflections that didn't match reality, whispered voices, and the feeling of being watched. Claire, an artist searching for inspiration, decided to spend a weekend at the lodge. The desk clerk gave her the key to Room 42 with an apologetic smile. "You're the only one brave enough to request it," the clerk said. Claire laughed it off, intrigued by the challenge. When she stepped into Room 42, she found it quaint and cozy. A plush bed, a small desk, and a large antique mirror mounted on the wall above a vanity. The mirror caught her attention immediately. It was ornate, with a frame carved to resemble twisting vines and flowers. That night, as she unpacked, Claire noticed the mirror seemed to shimmer slightly, as though the glass weren't entirely still. She chalked it up to her tired eyes and poured herself a glass of wine before settling into bed. At 3:15 a.m., she woke to the sound of soft whispers. Her heart thudded as she glanced around the dark room. Everything was still, except for the mirror. In the faint moonlight, she could see her reflection sitting up in bed, but something was wrong. The reflection wasn't mimicking her movements. Instead, it was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, revealing sharp teeth where there should have been none. Claire froze, unable to look away. Her reflection tilted its head, the grin widening as it raised a hand to wave at her. She didn't move. Then the reflection began to stand, though Claire remained frozen in place. It stepped out of the bed in the mirror's world and walked toward her. Claire's breath hitched as the figure pressed its hands against the inside of the glass, leaving smudges that glistened like blood. "Let me in," it whispered. Her scream caught in her throat as the glass began to crack, hairline fractures spidering out from where the figure's hands pressed. Summoning all her courage, Claire grabbed the bedside lamp and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with an ear-splitting crash, the fragments scattering across the floor. The whispers stopped. Panting, Claire turned on every light in the room. The mirror's frame was empty now, the reflective surface gone. She gathered her belongings and fled to the front desk, insisting on a new room. The clerk gave her a replacement without question, though he avoided her gaze. The next morning, Claire returned to Room 42 to retrieve a forgotten sketchbook. The door was ajar, though she was certain she'd locked it. Inside, the mirror was intact, completely whole, as though it had never been broken. But when she stepped closer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, in the glass, was her reflection. It stood completely still, wearing the same too-wide grin. And as she turned to leave, it raised a hand to wave goodbye. The Crescent Inn was the kind of place you stumbled upon by accident. Hidden off a desolate road, its flickering neon sign promised vacancies to weary travelers. It had an unsettling air about it, but to Alex and Rachel, who were exhausted after a long drive, it seemed like salvation. The lobby was eerily quiet, lit by a single buzzing fluorescent bulb. The clerk, a pale man with sunken eyes, smiled too widely as he handed them the key to room 107. "You'll find it down the hall," he said. "Enjoy your stay, and don't open the door if someone knocks after midnight." Rachel chuckled nervously. "Is that a joke?" But the clerk didn't respond. The room was dated but clean, with floral wallpaper that had faded to a dull gray. Alex threw their bags on the bed while Rachel inspected the bathroom. "This place is weird," she muttered. Alex shrugged. "It's one night. Let's just crash and get out of here tomorrow." As they settled in, an odd sensation crept over them, like the room was slightly off. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed too dark, almost alive. By 11 p.m., they were both in bed, trying to ignore the strange atmosphere. At 12:15 a.m., there was a knock on the door. Both of them sat up instantly. "Who's that?" Rachel whispered. Alex glanced at the clock and remembered the clerk's warning. "Don't answer it," he said firmly. The knock came again, louder this time. They stayed frozen, staring at the door. Then came the voice. "Please, I need help," it said. It was a woman's voice, trembling with fear. "There's something out here. Let me in." Rachel started to move, but Alex grabbed her arm. "No," he hissed. "We don't know who or what that is." The knocking became frantic, the woman's pleas turning to sobs. "Please, he's coming! He's going to kill me!" Rachel's resolve faltered. What if she's really in trouble? Before Alex could stop her, Rachel approached the door. "Wait!" Alex shouted. But it was too late. Rachel turned the lock and pulled the door open. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, but a cold, foul-smelling wind swept into the room. "Hello?" Rachel called out, stepping into the hall. "Rachel, come back inside," Alex demanded, but she didn't respond. A shadow moved at the far end of the hallway, humanoid but distorted. It didn't walk. It glided, unnaturally fast, toward her. "Rachel!" Alex screamed. She turned to run back into the room, but the shadow reached her first, wrapping around her like smoke. Her scream was cut off as she was dragged into the darkness, disappearing from sight. The door slammed shut, and Alex found himself alone in the room. Heart pounding, he grabbed his phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room deepened. And then came another knock at the door. This time it was Rachel's voice. "Alex, let me in. It's me." But her voice was wrong. Too flat, too calm. Alex backed away from the door as it rattled violently. "Let me in," the voice repeated, now low and guttural. "I'm cold out here." The shadows in the room began to shift, coalescing into a dark humanoid figure that loomed in the corner. Its glowing red eyes fixed on Alex as it whispered, "You shouldn't have opened the door." The next morning, the clerk found room 107 empty. The bed was untouched, the key still on the desk, but the room was freezing cold, and the floral wallpaper had begun to peel, revealing dark stains underneath. No trace of Alex or Rachel was ever found, but some nights guests claimed to hear frantic knocking coming from the hallway, followed by a woman's desperate cries for help. Deep in the Pacific Northwest, locals spoke of the Blackwater Ferry, a vessel that only appeared on foggy nights. It wasn't listed in any schedule, and its captain and crew were never seen. Yet, travelers desperate to cross the vast, dark river sometimes found it waiting at the dock, shrouded in mist. Logan had heard the stories, but didn't believe them. He was driving cross-country and found himself lost late one night, with his GPS leading him down winding roads toward the river. When he reached the dock, the fog was so thick he could barely see beyond his headlights. And there it was, the ferry. It was an old, rusted ship with weathered paint and a faded name barely legible on the hull. Ecliptic. Its ramp was lowered, inviting him to board. Logan hesitated but reasoned it must be a local ferry running late. He drove his car onto the deck, and the ramp creaked as it lifted behind him. The ferry's engine roared to life, and it began to glide across the water. Logan stepped out of his car, looking around for a crew member to pay. The deck was empty. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the thick fog. No answer. A faint bell rang from somewhere in the mist, its mournful tone echoing across the river. Logan shivered, the cold dampness clinging to his skin. He leaned against the railing, staring into the dark water below, when he noticed something moving beneath the surface. At first, it looked like a shadow, then another and another. Shapes writhed just under the water, large and serpentine. The longer he stared, the more distinct they became. Human-like faces with hollow eyes staring back at him, mouths open in silent screams. He stumbled back, heart pounding, and nearly tripped over a rusted chain. "Sir!" "You shouldn't have come aboard." Logan spun around to find an old man in a tattered captain's uniform standing behind him. His eyes were milky white, his skin pale and weathered. "What do you mean?" Logan stammered. "I just need to cross the river." The captain shook his head. "This ferry doesn't take passengers to where they want to go. It takes them to where they belong." Before Logan could respond, the fog began to shift, revealing the opposite shore. But it wasn't a shore at all. Jagged cliffs jutted from the water, and the land beyond was barren and gray. The sky above churned with storm clouds, though there was no rain or wind. Figures stood at the edge of the dock, motionless and cloaked in shadows. "What is this place?" Logan whispered. The captain's voice was cold. "This is where lost souls are delivered. You're lucky. You still have a chance to turn back." "How?" Logan cried. "Jump." Logan hesitated, but the figures on the dock began to move, their twisted forms lurching toward the ferry. Their glowing eyes locked on him as they stretched bony hands in his direction. Without another thought, Logan climbed the railing and leapt into the freezing water below. The shock of the cold was like knives piercing his skin, but he swam desperately, the writhing shadows below surging toward him. Just as they reached him, a bright light cut through the fog. He gasped and opened his eyes to find himself lying on the riverbank, his car parked beside him. The ferry was gone, the river calm. Shaking, he climbed into his car and sped away, vowing never to return. To this day, locals claim to see the Blackwater ferry gliding silently across the river on foggy nights, and those who board it, they're never seen again, unless they're lucky enough to jump.